Are you curious about new Australian wine regions and styles? How can an emotional guide help you understand and appreciate wine and deepen your pleasure of it? And what was it like being a woman experiencing the unfair and sexist consequences of several Master Sommelier scandals? Well, tonight you're going to get those stories and tips and a lot more. If you're watching this video on the replay, please in the comments type the word replay. I'd like to know where you're logging in from, what's in your glass, what's the weather like. And of course, if you're here with me live, I'd like to know the same. If you're here for the first time, I'm Natalie McLean, and I offer popular online wine and food pairing classes, and you've just joined the most passionate group of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine. Now, I am here live in the comments, but this is a recording of a video that was made for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. And before I introduce our guest, just let me say I want to hear from you. Let me know what stories or tips you like, if there's any questions that aren't answered, and I'll be in there in the comments with you. Also, I wanted to say that two of you are going to be the lucky recipients of a copy of this guest's book. So one of you will win her first book, Vignette, Stories of a Life and Wine in 100 Bottles. And one of you will win her latest book, which has just been published. It's all about Australian wines. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com, and I'll pick two, one each, randomly to win the books. All right, back to our guest. Jane Lopes is a sommelier, author, and importer. She's worked at some of the most prestigious restaurants in the world, including New York's 11 Madison Park, Nashville's The Catbird Seat, Chicago's The Violet Hour, and Attica in Australia. Jane was featured in Esquire Network's 2015 television series Uncorked, which follows 6 New York City sommeliers in pursuit of the Master Sommelier title. In September of 2019, Jane finally put her University of Chicago literature degree to good use, as she says, in publishing her first book, a personal and educational guide to wine called Vignette, Stories of Life and Wine in 100 Bottles. In 2020, Jane and her husband Jonathan Ross co-founded their own Australian wine importing company called Legend. Jane's second book, which she co-authored with her husband, How to Drink Australian, has just been published. And Jane joins me now from her home in Nashville. Welcome, Jane.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Most glad you are here. All right. So before we dive into your wine career, Jane, tell us why you chose to study Renaissance literature at the University of Chicago.
Um, uh, Great question. I started off my college career at USC in LA as a business major. And that just wasn't the right fit for me. And I had a really influential English literature teacher, specifically Renaissance literature, my first year of college at USC. And I was a research assistant for the Norton Anthology of Literature, and specifically the Renaissance section. So that kind of set me on that track of just really enjoying that era of
Yeah.
literature. So then I transferred to University of Chicago and just stayed on that track, and just just really had a blast and didn't quite know what I was going to do with it, but I figured best to just sort of enjoy it at the time and figure that out later.
So a good quarter of the students at the University of Chicago go on to get PhDs and become academics. Were you on that track? And if so, why did you decide to jump off of it?
Yeah, I was. I by the time I graduated, I thought, well, I really like this environment. This is fun. I can keep doing this. And so, I didn't apply for graduate programs my senior year of college just because seemed like a lot to do in addition to kind of writing my senior thesis and all of that. So I was planning to take a year off. I had applied to work in the admissions department at my college and really thought I was going to get that job, and I didn't. And so I just needed a job, and I applied to work at a wine shop. I had really loved wine and the
Mm-hmm.
the 2 years I'd been drinking it, since I studied abroad in Italy when I was my junior year in college. And so I thought that would be a fun job, just a good thing to do for a year. And, pretty quickly after I started working in that wine shop, I just really felt like I don't want to leave this yet. I want to see where this goes. So I stopped writing my grad school applications. And funny enough, the admissions department came back to me a few months later and offered me that job. And I
Oh,
already kind of knew I wanted to stay on the wine track and just kind of see where that took me.
and was there an aha wine, or was it just the business of selling wine was so interesting to you? What solidified it for you?
A little bit of both. There definitely was an aha wine in terms of like, wow, this is what wine can be, and who knew? But I think more than anything, it was really like, it was really just the combination of all that wine offered, because wine can be very academic, very intellectual. I remember
Mm-hmm.
a lot of nights coming home from my job at the retail store and just, you know, pulling out a wine book or a study guide on Guild Somm and just sort of like learning more. But I
Mm-hmm.
really also loved how wine was. I liked that knowledge was connected to an experience, right? And a sensory experience a lot of the time where I could, study the wines of the Northern Rhone and the soil type and the winemaking and the attributes of the Syrah grape, and then I could taste that in a glass. Like that
Mm.
to me was very exciting. And I also really loved the social aspects of it. When it came down to thinking about spending my 20s, in a library or talking to people and serving, great wine and pairing it with food. And, the latter seemed a lot more appealing.
Absolutely. I'm with you on that because wine sort of does get you out of your head all the time if you're inclined to be there and,
Yeah,
gets you reconnected with your senses and your body and the emotions and so on. So, what was that
totally.
aha wine, by the way? Do you remember one in
Um,
particular?
I do. It was a Louis Latour classic kind of negotiant Burgundy producer. It was Chevalier Montrachet, 1983.
Mm.
And I think I'm getting the vintage right. I think it's 83. And I was having this in probably '07 or '08. A friend of mine who worked in consulting, not the
Mm-hmm.
wine industry at all, had invited me to kind of like a wine party that one of his bosses threw periodically, and that was sort of the boss always opened like a special wine in the beginning to make sure to get people to get there on time, which is a great strategy.
Yeah.
So I got to taste that wine, and it just, I probably hadn't never tasted, Grand Cru Burgundy. I probably had never tasted wine that old, and it just like was just blew my mind. I just couldn't believe all of the different things I was tasting and smelling and how vibrant it still felt. And yeah, I was really blown away by that wine.
Wow. Okay. Now, you've noted that it is hard to get a good wine education. I mean, it's definitely expensive if you're not in the trade. But what did you mean by that? It's really hard to get a good wine education.
Well, if you think about a lot of other fields, even something like that people maybe argue is impractical, like studying literature, there are very sort of specific and well-defined channels to pursue that field. You go to college, there's at every college there's dozens if not hundreds of different literature courses offered, and you can do an undergraduate program, you can do graduate programs, you can do master's programs. It's these very kind of well defined steps, and certainly you want to be a doctor or a nurse or an accountant or whatever it is. There's this very well defined kind of educational path, and there just isn't that for wine. There are certainly a few culinary schools that have some great wine programs throughout the U.S. Um, but that's uh, less than a handful of schools in the entire country. And then there's WSET, and then there's Court of Master Sommeliers. But there's just not as well defined path as for many other professions. So I think that, I think that causes some, um, I don't know if the word is issues. It just, it is a situation in our industry that is, not totally unique in the world, but certainly, uh, is individual to kind of, a handful of professions. And so, we're just sort of left to our own devices to figure out how best to learn to learn wine service, to learn wine writing, to learn, wine imports and distribution, and kind of all of the
It's
different
true.
facets of the wine industry.
Yeah, it's more of an apprentice or learn on the job or whatever. But and there's even far more, I think, channels to learn cooking than there is
Oh,
wine.
100%.
There's
Yeah.
so many schools and courses and certifications.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. Um, so you've worked at some really great restaurants, and you've spoken about the physicality of a restaurant job. In what ways would the physical aspects of working in a restaurant surprise us?
Um, yeah, it's we in restaurants certainly give a lot of thought to sort of the shoes we're wearing and things you don't think about, like what the floors of a restaurant are. Like when I started working at 11 Masson Park, the floors are terrazzo. They're just like incredibly hard,
Oh,
and
okay.
harder than certainly carpet or even wood. That like it just is really hard on your joints, like your knees, your hips. I just remember, when I started working in that restaurant, just like waking up in the morning and just like aching.
Oh,
Because you're just on your feet for a very long time, and you're moving around kind of rapidly for most of that time. And then of course there's like the schlepping boxes and stuff like that. I mean, when I was at 11 Masson Park, we had a lot. We probably fit about double the amount of wine into that cellar than, was the actual capacity. And so there were, lots of cases kind of stacked up high. So there was, you know, we were almost every day you were on a ladder with a case of wine on your shoulder, climbing up a ladder, putting that case up there, and taking cases down.
wow.
Um,
And I
so
wonder how
it,
much that weighs, a case of wine. It would depend on if it was a heavy wine bottle, but what
yeah,
is that, like 20, 30 more pounds? I don't know.
yes, I would say, 35. I'd say 30 to
Yeah.
40 is kind of pretty
That's a
average.
lot, though. Yeah,
Yeah,
especially just trying to hoist it up while you're climbing on a ladder.
totally.
Holy.
Yes, I definitely developed some new muscles at that restaurant.
Yeah, so that's very, and then the working hours are late and so on. So yeah, they are very, very hard jobs. People don't, those diners often don't appreciate just what's going on behind the scenes, and especially as you say, if you have an overstuffed cellar, you're probably having to move boxes every time you try to find a wine. It's not like you're just pulling them out of a slot. So
Yes.
now, while you're the wine direct, I think it was wine director at Catbird Restaurant in Nashville,
Yeah.
you started experimenting with how you served wine. Tell us some of the creative ways you started, what you were experimenting with.
Yeah, I think at that point I sort of didn't, know enough to know, uh, I think how, heretical I was being in a sense. But, um, when I moved to Nashville to take on the position at Catbird Seat, I was coming from Chicago. And at the time, certainly, there was just a lot more access to wine in Chicago than there was in Nashville. And so there would kind of be in the way that the sort of the flow of the week worked at the Catbird Seat is the chefs would usually change one or two or sometimes more dishes every single week. So the menu was changing really rapidly. So it was sort of on me. They would usually give me like, a description on like a Saturday of the dish that was coming on the next week. And I sort of just had to kind of scramble to come up with a pairing, on the fly. And then sometimes, I would taste the dish on when it was going live, and maybe my pairing worked, maybe it didn't. And so there was sort of this need to be really flexible, and adaptable. And so, for example, there was the, the wines of Cornelison from Sicily, very famous sort of natural wine producer in Sicily, and they had this really sort of wild, volatile quality to them. And I really, wanted to pair a wine like that with this sort of like vinegar-rich pork dish that one of the chefs had come up with, um, and that wine wasn't in Nashville, so I sort of made it myself by combining a sort of very, classic a Sicilian red wine. I think it was a Neredavola with some like a red sour beer. And it also really gave me the flexibility that like if that dish came out and it was a little more acidic than I was even anticipating, you could up the beer, and if it was less, you could pull it back. And I think with that dish, I actually served it on the side and let the guests combine it themselves, and that also sort of provided this really unique interactive feature with the
Yeah.
wine pairings.
So a glass of
So
beer and a glass of wine, you served them side by side. You weren't pouring them together yourself?
No, I think for that one, I let people do it themselves. And it was sort of
Okay.
like the beer was like in a little sidecar, so people could taste it themselves. But I did say these are meant to be combined. You can put a little bit in, you can put a lot in, see
Oh, fun.
what works for you, see what you like. Have fun. Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think,
that's great.
yeah, it was fun. And it definitely, we had lots of regulars at that restaurant who sort of came to expect pairings like that.
Ha, that's great. And then another one, I forget the exact combination, but you rinsed a wine glass with bourbon, and then did you put Tokai in it or something
Yeah,
else?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So it was this dish that was on the menu for a long time. It was like a vanilla cake with, I'm not gonna remember it exactly, but I think cherries, and then there was like I think a bourbon ice cream, and then also these little like encapsulated bourbon pearls that like
Ooh.
literally like you put in your mouth and it would like burst like open and be bourbon. It was delicious, and so
Mm.
I kind of just wanted to incorporate a few aspects of the dish. And so I used an atomizer and just would spray the glasses with bourbon, and then pour in the Tokai. And it did a really nice job of sort of, um, it sort of took this sweetness edge off of the Tokai. Obviously, it was
Mm.
still quite sweet, but it just sort of gave it a little bit more of a savory edge that really worked with the dish. And it was just fun. And again, I think you can't sort of overstate the power of getting people to really engage in something like that. I think sometimes people
Mm.
do pairings and you're a bit on autopilot and you're just getting poured wine after wine. And sometimes they can be amazing, but I think it's really fun to get people to kind of be like, whoa, what's going on here? We're doing something different, and just really engage with it and have fun with it.
Absolutely, because it's done with food all the time, like from molecularizing asparagus into foam to all kinds of other things. So why not with wine?
Yeah.
Be have fun, be heretical, and have fun.
Yeah.
Um, and for those who are not familiar, Tokai being this sort of sweet dessert wine from Hungary
Yep.
that has a beautiful peachy preserve apricot kind of sweetness, which would have been, I think, beautiful with that dessert, but needing that bourbon edge, as you said.
Yeah.
Was there any other little like other unique combos that you can recall?
Yeah. Let's see. Did like a sparkling rosé with sake for a dish that was really
Oh,
good.
and why did that
Um,
work? Like, what was the inspiration there?
oh, I don't remember.
It's okay. Many
um,
combinations ago.
yeah, and I think again it kind of spoke to like there probably just wasn't a lot of, now you can find sparkling sake in a lot of places. Like I
Right.
think at the time I kind of thought about sparkling sake for that dish, because I wanted sort of the texture of a sparkling wine, but I wanted the flavors of the sake, and I just did there wasn't access to that in Nashville, so I was like, well, I got sparkling wine, I got sake, create it
Just do
myself.
it. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it was, I'm trying to remember other ones. I did like falernum, which is like a clove lime rum liqueur. And
Okay.
I did that with uh, like a pinot gris. It was for a foie
Huh.
gras dish that I
Oh.
kind of wanted those flavors, but not in like a and in that, I wanted it in the form of a wine. I wanted the texture and balance of a wine, but with more of those flavors. So just gotta, just played around a bit.
That's great. All right, so let's talk about your first book. Why did you name it Vignette?
Um, the working title for that book was Enophilia, which the publishers felt sounded like some sort of disease. And they're not wrong. So, it is a story. It's a book with a lot of like sort of individual stories about my life and how that relates to wine. So it really just came to me one day, was like, vignette. That's
Yeah.
perfect, because vignette's this like, short story, but it's also has this like vine in the word. So I'm very happy I kind of just happened upon that name, because I don't know
It's
where
perfect.
where else we would have ended up. But yeah, it ended up being perfect.
And it sounds feminine too. Like Vignette sounds like the feminine version of something, whatever the masculine version might be,
Yeah.
vine or whatever, vino. And you call it an emotional guide to wine, which I absolutely love. Tell us more about that. Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, so yeah, it is really stories from my life. Starting kind of chronologically, and like, my parents sort of drinking cheap oaky Chardonnay when I was growing up, and sort of like how I got into wine, and then following me through kind of starting my career and working in various places and taking these exams, and meeting my now husband and our relationship. And wine kind of acted as, this maybe sounds bad, but sort of this constant companion, and not in
Mm-hmm.
like a I'm gonna get drunk to forget my worries sort of way, but like in this sort of punctuating my life in really lovely ways, and I remember a lot of the bottles that I was drinking in the important moments of my life, and how they helped bring um, me closer to my goals in my career, how they help bring me closer to the people in my life. And so, and that was really something I wanted to impress upon people. I think a lot of wine books are focused on, you know, the land, the people who are making wine, the history, which is all really wonderful. But I think, something that I really want people to take away from wine is that it should just be this like, beautiful thing that can be a great part of your life, and you can have this really wonderful sort of emotional connection to, um, even if you don't want to learn all the vineyard names and soil types and, grape percentages and all that stuff, that wine can just be this like, yeah, really kind of fun, lovely part of your life that doesn't depend on it being super academic. But I did want to include an academic component as well, because that was so important to my journey, was learning about wine.
Mm-hmm.
So I can show some. This is that book.
There's your book.
It's kind
Yes.
of matching
And for those
my.
who are listening, we'll put a link in the show notes. Yes. Lovely.
But so after each chapter, there's like a piece of educational content. And I really wanted them to be fun, approachable, maybe offer a different lens for the expert, and offer like a kind of approachable entry point for the novice. Um,
Yes.
and so, like, this is like a flow chart I did after a chapter that talked about blind tasting. And it just kind of breaks down blind tasting, and not like a really, certainly, as you can see, not like in a really basic way, but in a way that simplifies it a bit. Because I think we'll talk about tasting a bit later, but I think it's intimidating because people are like, oh, am I supposed to taste the like marigold in this, and if I don't taste that aspect, then I'm not going to know what it is. And like, it kind of breaks it down to a little bit more of a simple flow chart of like, okay, if I get a red wine and I get jammy fruit off the bat, I'm looking for, oak presence, and that's going to lead me to like my next kind of like tier on the flow chart. And basically you can make sort of a few key judgments about a wine and ascertain a lot of information about it, where it doesn't require you being able to identify like all these like crazy little nitpicky things. So there's just a lot of stuff like that I
And you
had.
illustrated this yourself, didn't you, throughout the book? Like you've also included a lot of illustrations.
There are a lot of illustrations. They're not mine.
Oh,
That is
okay. Okay.
not a talent I have. It's this woman named Robin Coucher who's really incredible. So like this is
Oh, well.
uh,
Okay, and you're holding up to the camera
a
here.
sort of a comic strip about the master som process, and so there's just a lot of fun, sort of irreverent stuff. But it's that line where it's not dumbing it down. It's
Sure.
presenting a lot of high level information, but in a way that hopefully is a bit more fun and accessible.
Yeah, and you said you sort of touched on this, but just to clarify, you said there's three ways to read the book. So presumably you could go through it just for the wine education, all those bits that'll teach you about wine. What are the other two ways? Just looking at your life vignettes, the memoir
Yeah,
aspect?
exactly. And I
Okay.
definitely heard from a lot of people that they're like, I kind of skipped over the wine education the first time around. I just wanted to read your story. And
Mm-hmm.
then the third way is sort of just as like a list of wine suggestions, because every chapter has 1 to 3 bottles listed depending on the style. So like, um, the first chapter is champagne and the bottle is Krug, and that's because that bottle was integral to that story, and it was about the master sommelier exam and how they always serve Krug at the reception. And but then in the back I do a little compendium that lists some value bottles, because some of them obviously we're not going out and drinking Krug every day or Chevalier Montrachet, so it was here's a list of 5 bottles that if you want to taste champagne and get a good idea for what this style is all about, here are some more affordable bottles. And then went through for every single style in the book. So if you really wanted to just get a great sort of tasting education when it came to wine, the book really covers pretty much every style of wine you would want to taste.
Huh, excellent. Wow, that sounds great. And then you also included resources for alcohol use disorder, I guess they call it now, alcoholism, in your book. Why? What inspired that?
Yeah, I think wine to me has been this really sort of like beautiful part of my life, and I feel really lucky that it's been able to be that. Um, People who have alcohol use disorder, it's not able to be a beautiful part of their life. I really do believe that it's not anyone's fault. It's not a character flaw. It's a disease like any other. And I've had people close to me who have suffered from it. And uh, in that case, most people in that situation have to not drink anything, that there really isn't sort of a gray area. I do think there's certainly alcohol abuse in our industry and at large that maybe isn't doesn't go as far as being alcohol use disorder, alcoholism, and there are definitely like those cases. Just some moderation can come into play, but I think that it's really important to talk about that side of it. That it's not all fun games, that alcohol can be abused and it can be dangerous and it can be fatal, and we just need to kind of all be aware of how we're using how we're using and abusing alcohol, and make sure we stay on the healthy side of things.
Absolutely. No, I commend you for doing that. Do you think the industry, the wine industry, encourages excessive drinking?
Um, not, I guess not overtly, right? It's not like there's not like this overt, like, oh gosh, you have to drink all the time, and this is what's right and you must do it. But it's definitely very easy to fall into excessive drinking in the industry, because um there's always a tasting or an after party or an event. And a lot of times it's really tasty stuff. And you want to socialize with people in your industry. And so it is easy, I think, to fall into excessive drinking. And so I think it is just important to be, to be conscious of it. I think our bodies are pretty intelligent, and they tell us um, when something has crossed the line into not being healthy anymore. And I think if we kind of all pay attention to that, we'll probably be able and I think it's probably different for everybody what, a healthy amount is.
Sure.
I know for me personally, as I've gotten older, it's become less and less. And I'm very intentional about, when and what I drink. And, still, I always want this to be, uh, an enjoyable, healthy part of my life. So I'm not kind of the person who's like going hard for the holidays and then taking January off. I'm kind of just the person who's always sort of a very balanced, moderate level. So it never sort of gets to a level where it feels even a little bit out of control.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we do talk about it. I talk about it in my new book too, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. I just don't think we acknowledge it enough, and that people do look to us, those in the industry. I don't know about you, Jane, but I get a lot of texts and emails, especially from women, but men as well and others, saying how much is too much, or looking at my consumption as some sort of guideline. Well, if she's drinking that much, it must be okay. So I'm cognizant of that too. The kind of, I don't know, not example, but norms you kind of establish even within your writing or what you post on social media
Totally,
can have
totally.
an impact. Yeah. Okay, cool. What was the most surprising insight that you discovered while you were writing this book?
Um, I think, and I detail some of my problems with anxiety and sort of just other health problems in my book. And um, I think one of the kind of great gifts that this book gave me was sort of, um, uh, I guess, finding um, some purpose in that. I think I'd always viewed it as this thing that was really dragging me down, and that how much better would my life would be with if I just didn't have any of these problems at all. And and this was the first time where I felt like this I've created something in the world, not in spite of these problems, but because of them.
Yes.
And that was really powerful, to feel like there was some purpose, some reason, if not, not if you don't believe sort of like in the it all happens for a reason sort of thing, but just finding purpose in things, right?
Right.
Where I found a way that this could both be really sort of cathartic for me, and I could sort of get this out there, because I think one of the hardest parts about anxiety or depression, mental illness, or just kind of invisible illness, undiagnosed illness, is that it not only do you have to deal with the symptoms you're dealing with, but you also kind of have to deal with this like hiding it from people,
Mm.
because it's hard to just say like, oh yeah, I'm kind of sick, but doctors don't know why. And it's
Mm-hmm.
this it's
Yeah.
you kind of just have to like kind of hide it from people, and a lot of times it's really hard too. And so it was really valuable for me to just be able to like, okay, I'm not hiding this anymore, it's just out there.
Mm-hmm. It's
And
freeing. Yeah.
yeah, it's totally freeing. And then, a lot of people reached out to me who
Mm.
were dealing with similar problems, especially in the
Yes.
wine industry, especially sort of taking exams in the wine industry and dealing with these problems. And, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if I was able to help those people, but I think just being able to talk about it with someone who knows, what you've gone through is a big first step.
I think that's healing, again, maybe cliche, but to know you're not alone, because then
Totally.
you don't think I'm just the weird one out here. It's all me, my issues. And then to realize just how incredibly common some of these issues are.
Yeah,
And until you talk about them, no one else feels comfortable about talking about them. But then the
totally.
floodgates open, and it is so
Totally.
freeing. Yeah. And what's the most interesting thing someone has said about your book?
Um, Obviously there were, yeah, lots of people reached out to me with kind of very kind words, and I still, when I'm on the road a lot for my current job, and I still definitely get, especially young women, a lot of young women who are like, "Oh, your book, got me through this really hard period, or got me through this exam, or made me want to work in this industry, or made me want to keep working in this industry." And so, all of those things were really heartening. The funniest thing was a review on Amazon, which I kind of stopped reading them. They're mostly positive, but of course, there's always going to be someone, and there was just this guy who was like, "Oh, lots of good wine information, but just skip over all the millennial drama." I was like, okay, no one's ever accused me of
That's
millennial
funny.
drama before, but that's okay.
Oh, people will take what they want from the book, and
Yes,
often what they say in those reviews has nothing to do with your book and everything about who they are and
totally.
how they perceived your book.
Totally,
Oh my
totally.
goodness.
I thought that one stuck with me. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, it is. You could reading mean tweets. I've always been tempted to read mean reviews, but then I think I'll probably just get a little aggravated if I start doing that.
Yeah, totally.
Um, so, um, so despite your anxiety, you agreed to be part of Esquire's television series Uncorked, which, as I mentioned, followed six New York City sommeliers in pursuit of the Master Sommelier title. Why did you agree to be part of that series?
Um, Another great question that I definitely asked myself a lot. Um, I think a lot of people watched the Somme movie, the first one.
The
Um,
documentaries, yeah. Hmm.
yes, and especially a lot of women didn't see their face in there, right? It followed four
Right.
men. And I know Jason Wise, the filmmaker, very well, and he's a good friend. And there were certain kind of circumstances that led to that being all men, and it wasn't his intention. So this is no shade on him. But I did think it was important that there was a female representation in that world, and they had approached me and one other woman, and she ended up dropping out. So I just felt like, oh, if I don't do this, this is just going to be all men again. And I also kind of felt like, well, if I'm suffering from anxiety, maybe I just kind of put myself in the most high anxiety situations I possibly could. And, maybe this sort of is a form of exposure therapy that can help get me kind of over it. Which, I don't
Did
think
it
was
work?
that effective.
No.
Uh, no, I know. But I think, right, there's different forms of anxiety. I think it's chronic anxiety, generalized anxiety or acute anxiety, whatever it is very different than like, I'm afraid of spiders and I'm
Right.
gonna go, let a tarantula crawl in my hand to get over it. I think that's very different than like, just I suffer someone who really suffers from anxiety. So yeah, I think the exposure therapy works less well in the latter. But I'm still very glad I did it. I think just, yeah, good for a woman to be up there, but then also, you see the results of my anxiety in a very visual way in that show.
How
And
so?
um there was one episode that was a competition.
Uh-huh.
It was a top som competition, and I had to double decant, which of course kind of, so you pour the bottle into a decanter and then you pour the decanter back into the bottle. And this is
Oh.
typically used, it can be used for aeration. It can be used for sediment, but of course then you need to rinse the bottle before you put wine back into it. Um, so yeah, it can be done for a few different reasons, but you, for whatever reason, you want to get the wine back in the bottle so people can see the label, so it's not in just a sort of anonymous decanter. So they asked me to double decant. Yes,
This is
this,
during a service exam?
Yes,
Oh,
the
okay.
competition.
Competition, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So of course, like, and I actually have like a water jug here, so I can kind of show you, like here's a bottle of
Sure.
wine. So you
That's
pour
hard.
the bottle of wine into the jug, and then you have to pour the jug back into the bottle of wine. And so
Without
you,
dripping, presumably.
yes, yes. And so, when you're decanting, you're sort of dealing with an opening at least that big. And then when you
Yeah.
go back into the
Much
bottle, it's
bigger.
much smaller opening. Yeah. So
Right.
it is sort of a skill that requires a steady hand.
Hard enough to do it when you're
And
not being judged, I would imagine. But here
for
you've got
sure.
judges staring you down.
Yes. So,
Oof.
and cameras, right? Like,
Right. Mm-hmm. And
so
competitors.
yeah. So you can see my hand shaking.
Yeah.
Pretty like, I haven't gone back and watched it in a while, but in my sort of sense memory, pretty violently shaking.
Oh,
Um, but I didn't spill a drop,
wow.
um, which is pretty miraculous. And it kind of made me feel like, okay, this sucks. It was really hard. It was really stressful, but like I could still get the job done. And
Huh.
that was like a little bit sort of heartening where it was like, okay, this is going to be something I have to deal with, but I can still get the job done. And it also resulted from that. One of the judges actually reached out to me and they were like, "Hey, have you ever tried beta blockers? They really help with shaking." And I was like, why didn't someone tell me this sooner? And so this is not like a, a long-term anxiety medication. It's
Sure.
just something you would kind of take. I would take a half an hour before a service exam or, a competition or something. And it
And a
actually
lot of
really
people
helped.
do, like speakers, even
Yes,
television actors and so
100%.
on. Just it
Yeah,
slows
yeah,
your heart rate and it just gives you a bit of a calm. It doesn't deaden you, but it's a nice effect to if you're shaking and yeah, feeling really uptight. Yeah.
totally. And I actually found no other kind of effects on me except it really just did help sort of with the shaking. So
Yes.
that was another, good thing. I think it's one of those things where like no one can help you with your problems until I know what they are, where it was like
Exactly.
this came out and then someone was able to help me when in the past I would have never told anyone, really tried to keep that like, hidden. When it did come out, I was able to get help.
Was this the competition, or was it the Master Sommelier exam where you actually tried to self medicate by taking some Sudafed?
That was my advanced exam, and that wasn't,
Okay.
I actually was in a very good place with my anxiety during my advanced exam. I wasn't, I think I was sort of normal nerves, but I was sleeping through the night. I was kind of feeling really good going into that exam. I was having the normal sommelier anxiety about your nasal passages,
Sure.
which,
Oh, right. Okay.
if you
Hmm.
ever go to one of these exams, there's like a neti pot in every room. Everyone's just like doing everything they can to keep their nasal passages clear. And so I was just like, I was feeling like I was getting a little stuffy and I was just a little nervous about it. And this guy from Canada was there and he had some Sudafed, like some, the real stuff
Yeah.
that you can't get over the counter in the US. And which is, of course, a stimulant. Like this is what's used to make meth. That's why you can't get it over the counter in the
Okay.
US. And
Oh, those Canadians. They're all
I know.
up with their drugs, aren't they?
It may not be the case anymore. I don't know. But
No, we're still taking it up
okay,
here.
okay. So I kind of just didn't really realize it was a stimulant, and I don't do well with stimulants. I can't
Sure.
do caffeine. Um, and like I took a Sudafed, and I was like, I both like my heart was racing, but I also
Oh,
felt like I could barely keep my eyes open. So
oh.
this was like through the morning exams and through lunchtime, and I was like, what is going on? And I eventually kind of realized it was probably that. But like
Mm.
I ended up going to the hospital. Like I
Oh
passed
no.
out and like couldn't feel my limbs.
Oh my
And like
gosh.
finally like regained sensation in my hand and I called the like I was, in the hotel and I like called the front desk. I was like, "Hey, I can't really like move." And I mean, it was really embarrassing. They like
Oh.
sent like, paramedics came up, put me on a stretcher, like
Wow.
I had just gotten out of the shower. I think I was in like a t-shirt and my underwear, like pushed me through the lobby of the hotel. Like all the master sommeliers are like, what's going on?
Oh my gosh.
And this was the night before the exam started.
Oh dear.
Um, but you know, it kind of left my system pretty quickly, you know, I went home later that evening from the hospital. And, you know, in a sense, it was, I think, in hindsight, at least it was sort of good. You know, I sort of was like, well, you know what? I'm not going to stay up till 4 a.m. studying and cramming information. I'm going to get a good night's sleep. I'm just going to feel as good as I can waking up tomorrow morning. And yeah, so that was no, that was a unique
Wow.
experience.
Absolutely. And for those listening, I mean, you want to keep your nasal passages clear, whether the neti pots or the Sudafed or antihistamines, because you've got to be on point to taste a lot of wines and all the tiny subtleties. I mean, that your exam marks are on the line because there is a blind tasting component to the master sommelier. So if people aren't familiar with the exam itself, that's kind of the motivation there to keep your passages clear.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Uh,
So, like, I mean, that the master sommelier takes a lot of preparation. How many years do you estimate it took, and like, how much do you think approximately you might have invested in your studying and wines tasted and all the rest of it to get to that point to be able to take the master sommelier exam?
Um, so there's four levels: intro, certified, advanced, and masters. So I took intro in 2009,
Hmm.
and then I passed masters in 2018. So it took
Okay.
me 9 years. I would think that's probably about average, maybe a little bit on the low side.
Right.
Um, Especially now where there's, you know, especially for the advanced exam, there's usually a wait list and you have to do the course 1 year and then the exam the second year. Um, so, you know, it can take quite a few years.
Hmm.
Um, and some people take the master's exam alone for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in a row, you know?
Yeah, because there's only a
Um,
10% pass rate or something abysmal, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's
Yeah.
once you get to the masters, you know, once
Right.
you've passed all these other levels. So, it is, yeah, I think it's people say it's the lowest passage rate of any exam in the world. And so, yeah, and you know, in terms of investment, it's hard to say. Like, you know, you're buying wines is a huge part of the investment because you need to taste wine. And so,
Sure.
you know, most people are part of kind of a tasting group, so you're able to share that cost over a few people. But you know, I remember myself and John, my now husband, we'd always have kind of bottles at home that we could corvin for each other and just sort of, you know, and sometimes these can be inexpensive bottles. Like if if a style is classically inexpensive, you know, like you're not going to spend $80 on a bottle of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc to
Sure.
bring to a tasting because that's the classic styles are more 15, 20, you know, 25 maybe. Um, but if you want to taste, you know, Premier Cru Burgundy or Brunello de Montalcino or, you know, styles that are classically expensive, you need to spend a bit of money on these. So, you know, I mean, and then you talk about the exam costs themselves and the travel and the lodging and the books you buy and, you know, the membership to Guildsom and all those things. I mean, it's easily 10, 15, maybe $20,000 investment,
Yeah.
which, you know,
Yeah.
in the
I've
scheme
heard
of
that.
sort of
Hmm.
education is not crazy expensive. But you're also not really paying for education, you know, you're paying for certification.
Right.
There isn't a huge educational component to those exams. So it is much more just sort of studying on your own and learning on your own and then bringing that to the exams.
Hmm. And do you think there should be an educational component?
Um, I mean, yes, right? There should be an educational component coming from somewhere.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if that the CMS is the right place for that. I mean, and not to say that there's no educational component. There's for the intro and the advanced exam, there is like a course that goes along with it, but it's
Hmm.
usually it's a few days at most. And you're not, like a college course, you pretty much learn what you need to know in the courses, and that's very much not the case with these. You sort of it's this sort of outline of what you need to know, and then you need to go away and learn it yourself. um at best it's an outline. A lot of times it doesn't even sort of even start to touch the amount of knowledge that you really need to pass these exams. um so yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I won't say that it needs to be CMS offering education, but you know, I do think there should be more kind of outlets for education in our industry.
Sure, sure. And so, did I understand correctly when I was looking at what you were doing in the lead up to the exam? You had a full time job, and you were planning your wedding and studying for this very, very difficult exam. Were you doing all three at once?
And writing my book.
Oh, and writing your book. Why not? In your spare time.
It was a
Wow.
hectic year. Well, so I the sort of the timeline, I'd taken the master's exam for the first time in 2015, and
Hmm.
you need to take theory and pass the theory component first until you can before you can take tasting and service. So I
Okay.
took theory in 2015 and I didn't pass. And I had just started working at 11 Madison Park, and I kind of just needed a break. My health wasn't in a great place. I was really enjoying EMP and sort of just wanted to focus on that and really enjoy it. So I was like, I'm going to take a year off. And then when I was sort of gearing back up to kind of study again in 2016, that's when I got the job offer to work at Attica in Australia. And so then it was kind of like, well, I need to make this move. I need to focus on being proficient at this job, taking on this new role. So I'm not going to take it in 2017 either. And then once I got to Attica and I sort of got situated there, I was able to sort of start thinking about it. And, the really wonderful thing about Attica and about a lot of places in Australia, there is a focus on work life balance more than there is in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And the chef owner at Attica, Ben Shuri, was very much like, you know, you're going to come in, you're going to, be present and work hard when you're here for a limited number of hours, and then, you're going to be able to go off and enjoy your life. Your life doesn't need to center around this restaurant, even though this restaurant is one of the greatest in the world and has, is on the top 50 list, San Pellegrino, and has aspirations of excellence. It still doesn't need to be your life. And so, of course, instead of me taking that as a license to like enjoy Australia and, take up hobbies, it was like a license to like, okay, what can I get done? And so I did feel like I can balance, this job with studying for the Master Sommelier exam. And at this point, I had written maybe 100 pages of my book, but sort of had put it on the back burner. I had an agent in the US and then terminated that relationship. And so I wasn't really thinking about the book. But then kind of a friend of a friend introduced me to a publisher in Australia. They were really interested. I kind of was just like started to talk to them, and they were like, okay, we want to give you a book deal. We need a manuscript by November. And I was like, okay. Um, and this was probably like April, and the theory exam was in July.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I basically said, great, I want to do this. I really want to publish this book, so let's do it. I'm probably not going to write more until I get through theory at least, because theory is really the most time consuming of the portions of the exam. So I got through theory, then I really sort of doubled down on like, okay, I gotta get this book, get some of this book written, and but while still preparing for service and tasting. And uh, that was in September of that year. And so, yes, I was, and then we were getting married in January. So I was dealing with a lot. I think it ended up being great for the wedding because I just wasn't really like stressed about it. I bought my dress on Etsy without trying it on. We had friends who were basically all of our vendors were our friends. We had friends who were florists, we had friends who was a photographer, friends who was the DJ, and we just
Well, that's
trusted them, and we
convenient.
were kind of
Yeah.
like you guys do what you want. Like we weren't like micromanaging anything. They were like, what flowers, what colors do you want for the flowers? I was like, I don't care. You make
Just
it
bring
look
some.
good. Like, yeah. So it was good. I think it made me very relaxed about my wedding.
Oh, that's good.
And yeah, everything, everything worked out.
That's great. So afterwards, like you were told you passed the master sommelier, but then what happened?
So of course that was another, hiccup I had to deal with that year. Um, so I think it was about 5 weeks after I passed, uh, I was notified. Well, I was supposed to be notified, but I was in Australia, and so they didn't wait to postpone the public announcement until they could tell me personally. So I kind of woke up to like a flurry of messages on my phone, and
Mm.
there was a press release that the Court of Master Sommeliers had sent out to, everyone on their email list, that said that due to, I don't remember the wording, but it became apparent due to one of the proctors cheating
Hmm.
and leaking information to a couple of the candidates, they were going to invalidate the whole exam.
Wow.
So it meant that everyone who had passed, who had been sort of, coronated a master sommelier, was, not any longer, and had to retake the tasting exam. So
Heartbreaking.
yeah, it really was. It was devastating. It was, and the most devastating part was honestly just like I kind of felt abandoned by a community that I had really sort of put up on a pedestal and worked really hard to be a part of. There wasn't there wasn't a lot of sympathy in the organization for what we were going through.
Yeah.
Um, and it just really seemed like they were more concerned with sort of managing optics than what this was doing to all of us. So that was, I think, the toughest thing to kind of just swallow.
Yeah, that's awful. And the way you found out about it. Why didn't they take the time to investigate, to find the culprits, if you will, and just punish them as opposed to revoking it from everybody who took the exam?
That's a great question, and I really honestly don't know. I think there's a lot of speculation that there was something more going on, or this had happened in other years, and they were afraid that an investigation would sort of unearth
Mm.
some things that could really take down the organization as a whole. I,
Wow.
I don't know about
Yeah,
that.
no, that sounds plausible, though. Hmm.
It's possible that they just felt like, well, I don't know. It's possible they just felt like this was the best course of action. I don't know how
Mm.
how one comes to that conclusion, but yeah, I don't really have the answer to that.
Yeah, no, yeah, and of course we can speculate, but that doesn't mean it's so. But still, it just sounds like a closing of the ranks, and let's just protect the organization. And if there's collateral damage, so be it, as opposed to examining truly what's going on, the deeper
Totally. Yeah.
issues. Yeah,
Yeah. That's really what it felt like from
yeah.
from
And
the
so why
inside.
you decided not to take the test again and not to sue them? Why not either of those options?
Um, you know, taking the test again, I think, there was lots of reasons, like I was angry with them and I didn't agree with the decision and sort of didn't want to like um sort of give my like tacit endorsement of the decision by going along with it. But I think ultimately what it came down to was like I could not get in the mindset again to take that exam. I think that exam takes so much dedication, so much focus, so much commitment, that I just felt personally like if I didn't 100% believe in it, believe in the reasons I was there, believe in the people who were the ones judging me, I just couldn't. I just felt like I couldn't get to the point where I could go in that room and take that exam.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so I just, it was the first retest they offered was December of that year, which I was in Australia and working in a restaurant. There was no way I was making it back to the US holiday season. So it kind of gave me some time to think about it a little more. And I just couldn't couldn't get back in that mindset.
I don't blame you. Um, and so then there was another thing, Master Sommelier, that just keeps, the hits keep coming. Um, you were part of, you went on record in Julia Moskin's excellent 2020 multi-page expose of the Court of Master Sommeliers. She wrote in the New York Times. So about a sexual harassment scandal in this case. And subsequently, I think 7 directors and the were either stepped down or were asked to leave. But the fallout was larger this time. Was it difficult to go on the record? Like, what made you decide to do that?
Um, yeah, I mean, by the time I actually made the decision, it was quite easy. But
Okay.
Julia had written an article a few years back about kind of this one guy in the New York wine industry who had kind of abused his power and sexually abused a number of women. And after that, in the aftermath of that, I think there was a lot of buzz about, well, this isn't the only time this has happened, and especially in the Court of Master Sommeliers, there's sort of a lot of offenders. And um, Victoria James and Liz Dowdy were both kind of people who had experienced things themselves and also heard a lot from other people. And so they reached out to me and asked if I would like kind of talk to a few women because I sort of had a different pocket of I guess like kind of a colleague and friend group in that in that organization than they did. So, I said yes, I would be happy to. Victoria knew I had had my own experience, and um, so at first I just sort of agreed, like, yeah, I'll talk to Julia. I'll talk to a few women if they want to share their story with someone they know personally, rather than a journalist first and foremost. And so I shared my story with Julia, but I was kind of like, this is probably not the best story you could include because, I kind of considered myself a problematic victim and that I didn't sort of at the time do much to stop it and I went on to be friends with the guy and um so I kind of was like, but yeah, you don't want to include my story. That doesn't really make sense. But then kind of when it sort of all came together, and especially I talked to so many women. Um, I had, I was in the photo
Mm-hmm.
um, that was being taken for the article. I was like, and Julia was just going to sort of use my quotes about the organization and some other things. And I was just like, this is how can I how can I expect change if I'm not willing to sort of put myself on the line? And so I actually went to her and I said, I think you should use my story. I think it doesn't make sense that I've been a part of this article, and if I don't kind of have my own personal story and sort of have and yeah, put my own kind of skin on the line as it were.
Good
So
for you.
thank you. Yeah, yeah, it
Absolutely.
ended up being an easy decision, but kind of yeah, took a few steps to get there.
Sure, I can understand. It's a big, big thing going on the record with the New York Times. Um, and you say that that the law hasn't kept up with sexual harassment, well, in many industries, but especially in the wine industry. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of protections for, workplace sexual harassment, not a lot, some, as well as certainly at universities and stuff like that. But there isn't really in sort of just like general industry relations or industry organizations. So there wasn't a legal angle. There were some lawyers who were sort of interested in it, like sexual harassment lawyers, but it was more from the perspective of like, um, how can we make change? Like, not you're not putting people in jail
Mm-hmm.
over this, like with the way things like are currently. Um, you're not really suing people either. Uh, how can we just make the industry a better place for generations to come?
Right. Right. And so, and I think you've spoken before about this, but would there be any way of having transformative justice in this case?
I think that probably looks different for every woman who has been involved in something. I don't think my personal incident affected my career in a negative way, or affected my involvement in the Court of Master Sommeliers in a negative way. Um, so I wasn't personally sort of looking for, um, I guess, sort of restitution in that respect.
Okay.
While I think some people very much were.
Mm-hmm.
For me, what I would really like to see is just more a more transparent certification process, because I think that's a huge problem with the Court of Master Sommeliers, and which has led to a lot of the problems, whether it's sexual harassment or the kind of exam integrity, the cheating scandal, or
Mm-hmm.
sort of accusations of racial bias, which, I think when you have an exam that has a lack of transparency, it's very easy for it to be abused, right? And I think
Right.
there was, either intentionally or not intentionally, I think there were just so many of us women who, we wanted to kind of prove our chops in this industry, and Court of Master Sommeliers was a major way to do that. And so, when there's no stated curriculum for the exam, really, there's no, they don't tell you, what your score is, what you got wrong. They don't reveal the wines that are in the exam. There's no appeal process, all these sort of
Wow.
things that make the exam just sort of just this very much like, when you pass, you pass. When you're ready, you'll pass. Like, it's really shrouded in mystery. It's very easy for you to feel like you have to sort of ingratiate yourselves to these important figures in the world. And when, these men would come into town, and this happened to me a few times, where they're like, "Oh, I'm not going to be able to do a practice flight for you, or anything, but like, hey, if you want to meet up for a drink later, and it in some circumstances it was innocent enough, and others it wasn't, and
Hmm.
it just feels like you kind of have to put yourself in these, compromising situations, because you don't know what going against these kind of powerful men would do to your chances in the organization or to your career in general. So
Wow.
I think for me, I think that's what sort of I would lobby for, is really sort of an overhaul of exam integrity and transparency.
That sounds like an excellent suggestion. Let's hope that gets done. Um, all right, I don't want to run out of time here because I want to focus on your Australian book. You and your husband, Jonathan Ross, have just co authored it, it's just been published. Tell us about it and how it's different from other books that have been written about Australian wine.
Well, I guess just to start, there haven't been a ton of books written about Australian wine. I think when you
Okay.
compare to kind of the scholarship on, Burgundy alone, let alone the whole of France, there's just very little. There are a couple Australian wine writers who are doing great work, usually on sort of more specific areas of Australian wine, whether it's kind of a certain historical thing, or like Max Allen is a great white writer. He has a alternative varieties Australian wine book coming out
Uh huh.
this year, which is really cool. But we
Okay.
just felt like there wasn't sort of this just like compelling modern wine book to really just give people a great overview of the Australian wine industry. Because when we started importing Australian wine to the US in 2020, we would pour these wines for people that were regions, producers, grapes they'd never had from Australia. And people really wanted to learn more and were really compelled by these wines. And we just didn't really have a good place to send them to learn more. So we sort of naively were like, we're going to write this ourselves, um, not sort of totally comprehending the amount of work that it would take. But we stayed the course, and we now have this like really beautiful 500 page. I can show this one as
Wow.
well.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. My goodness.
Wine book, that we've had kind of the first copy in the US for a few months. It already has some love on it. Um, but we just wanted something that felt kind of serious but was also beautiful. Like there's a lot of beautiful
The
photography,
photography is gorgeous, and
um,
maps. Wow.
all original maps. Like we
Wow.
just,
That's
there's
great.
some great illustrations.
Hmm. Oh,
I'm
great.
like, am I
Yeah.
holding it right?
Fun. Yeah, yeah, I can see.
um, So, we just we wanted there to be this resource to really like get the world excited about Australian wine. Like that was sort
Sure.
of our experience when we moved to Australia. We were just so blown away by Australian wine, and we couldn't believe that there's kind of was such a gap in knowledge and exposure for Americans.
Hmm.
Only about 10% of Australian wineries export to the US. So we
Wow.
just have this like very limited view over here of what's going on over there, and so we just really wanted to like kind of crack it open and get people really talking about these wines and thinking about these wines, because we just find them incredibly compelling and delicious and interesting. And it's just a shame that like the US and I think a lot of other countries around the world are just really missing out on these great wines.
Absolutely. And that's interesting that only 10% of Australian wineries export to the US, because I, I could be wrong in this stat. But I had a notion that Australia has to export most of its wines because it's such, it produces far more than it can drink. I thought I heard that it exports 90% of the wines it produces, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. And is it all, or was it going to Asia? I know China shut them down with big tariffs, but
Yeah. So
yeah.
I don't know if you're wrong about that, but so we're talking about volume versus number of producers, right? So
Okay,
there's
right.
a handful of big producers who make up most of the volume.
Yes.
And then there's just hundreds and hundreds of great small producers who aren't getting around, so who can sell everything they make in Australia. So I
Hmm.
think, yeah, you both things are true.
Okay.
Um, so and yeah, China was the leading export market up until 2020, when they levied quite hefty tariffs. And so, Australians have been kind of scrambling a bit to find sort of outlets for that wine.
Hmm.
Um, I think everyone is hopeful that China will, relax those soon. But I think it's also good to, you never want to have your eggs all in one basket.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've described Australia before as, I thought it was a good visual analogy, especially if we're talking here on a podcast, as kind of roughly speaking, it kind of looks like the US in its outline as a country. And then you were talking about sort of being in Melbourne, which is a beautiful, very artistic, culturally rich city, driving from there to somewhere else. I don't know if it was up to the wine regions, is like driving from San Francisco to LA or something. Maybe you could make that analogy. I'm probably butchering it here.
Um,
Um,
I probably like Sydney and Melbourne is kind of like San Francisco to LA.
oh, okay. Maybe it
It's a
was that.
it's
Yeah.
a little longer, but
Okay.
when
Along
you're
the
in Melbourne,
coast.
you're
Yeah.
actually you're quite close to a lot of great wine regions. You're within uh, a 2 or 3 hour drive of most wine regions in Victoria. You're within a 1 hour drive of a lot of the great wine regions of Australia, like Yarra Valley, Macedon Ranges, Mornington Peninsula. So it was a very exciting place to be because you really are in wine country living there. But yeah, I mean, Australia is incredibly diverse. I think a lot of times people think of it as like desert, and there certainly are some warm places in Australia. But as far as wine regions go, you have some of the coldest wine regions in the world, like Tasmania is colder than Champagne.
Huh.
Um, and you also have, yeah, some of the warmest wine regions of the world, but a lot of really kind of appropriate and sometimes old vine plantings for those regions. So it's really incredibly diverse. You can get everything from like pristine, kind of like delicate sparkling wines and Riesling to like, you know, beautiful Grenache and Mourvèdre and these grapes that do better in warmer climates. And Italian grapes do incredibly well in
Why
Australia.
do they do so well there, the Italian grapes?
Well, Australia, as I said, there are kind of those cool climates which are great for, your Chardonnays and your Pinot Noirs and your Riesling, and but then there's also there's a lot of sort of these warm, dry Mediterranean style climates that you know do very well with Mediterranean grapes and specifically Italian grapes, and it's really been really the last, I would say, 20 years that it's really become much more of a presence in Australia. And, I think there is a real push in Australia, and there's a real dexterity being a relatively young wine producing country in some ways. It's not like you're talking about Burgundy and the monks dating back 1,000 years and stuff. Like, although there's a ton of great old vine plantings, there is this sort of dexterity to say, okay, well, this pocket of my vineyard is pretty warm and pretty sun exposed, and like, maybe Syrah's not working so well here anymore. I'm gonna plant Aglianico or Nerda Avila, and these grapes that really do well in dry climates, do well with like small amounts of water, do well in warm climates. And so, yeah, it's really become quite common. And it's not just Italian, like Iberian grapes. There's kind of really almost every grape you can think of is in Australia. And someone is really championing it and has found out that it really works for their vineyard and their climate. And there's just really a focus on like site suitability for grapes. Some really exciting versions, and even I think if I came in definitely as like an Italian, maybe Italian wine snob. I really love my Italian wine, and I'm very, very impressed by what Australia is doing. It doesn't look exactly like Italy, but it's really legitimate and noble expressions of those grapes.
And you're a big fan of Grenache in
I
Australia.
am.
Why? What does it taste like, and how is it different from other regions where Grenache is planted?
Um, so Grenache is going through a great moment in Australia right now. It used to be like 10, 15 years ago, people were making Grenache, kind of trying to make it look like Shiraz because Shiraz was so popular. And so either adding kind of other grapes to make it darker, extracting it, picking very late, putting new oak on it. And now people like even describe it as like the warm climate Pinot Noir, that it's able to make these really kind of red fruited, moderate bodied, delicate, bright, refreshing styles of wine that don't lack in kind of like complexity either. And there's a lot of great old vine Grenache, old like usually bush vine Grenache planted across Australia. A lot in Barossa, McLaren Vale, Swan Valley has some really amazing plantings. And the style, I mean, I think they're transcendent. And I think my problem with a lot of Spanish and French Grenache is it feels very unpredictable. um, you know, both in terms of sort of like the style, like, are you going to get a Grenache that looks like Priorat and it almost looks like a Cabernet, it's dark and it's oaked, or are you going to get one like from Granada where it's more high toned and red fruited, but maybe it has Brettanomyces on it, which is, a yeast that gives a very specific flavor. I personally really don't like Brett in wines.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's kind of a concern both with French and Spanish Grenache, is a lot of them are bready.
Mm-hmm. It can taste sort of barnyard or whatever they call it. Some people
Yeah,
call it default too. Yeah.
yeah, and certainly in extreme amounts it is a fault. I can kind of, to me, I tolerate it in like aged Bordeaux or aged Northern Rhone, but to me, when it's like it can really dominate aromatics and flavor on young wines, and so for me, I always want to taste. I want to taste what that grape in place tastes like. I know what Brett tastes like. I can taste that. That's could be on any wine in the world. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what that grape in place tastes like. And I feel like
Sure.
Australia is just very consistent right now in this like beautiful medium-bodied, unoaked, red fruited style um, that is almost always clean, meaning no Brett, and rarely veers into that kind of dark fruited heavy oak style. So it's that to me is just like sort of the consistency you get from Australian Grenache, exceeds the consistency you get from Grenache from France and Spain.
That's great. And you have two wines that I would love to hear about. Are these wines that you import through your agency, Legend?
It is. They are. Um, uh, the labels are a little messed up. This is the beauty
It's
of
okay.
like tiny wine fridges in my house. But this is Naringa. There's Summit Vineyard Chardonnay from 2018. Naringa is a really impressive biodynamic producer in the Adelaide Hills in South Australia. Cool climate, high elevation. They've really done, they're among kind of a handful of producers who are sort of leading the conversation on regenerative agriculture in Australia. So it's always a pleasure to taste wines from people who are kind of at the forefront of just land care.
Mm-hmm.
But then their wines are also just really, really delicious. And they make a few sort of irreverent, fun things. They do a pet nat that's delicious. They work with a grape called Pink Semillon that like is wild and really cool. But for the most part, they focus on pretty classic stuff: Chardonnay, Syrah, Pinot Noir, and this is the single vineyard style from them.
Sounds lovely. And what's the other wine that you have there?
Um, Bird on a Wire. So Bird on a
Oh,
Wire is sort of a one-woman show. This woman named Carolyn Mooney in the Yarra Valley, and her family are dairy farmers. She grew up on a dairy farm in the Yarra, and just has knows everything there is to know about this region, and has great relationships with farmers across the region, and works with some really exceptional sites. One of our favorite things about what she does is she always releases the her wines with age. So this is a 2015, see it,
okay. Yeah.
2015 Syrah.
And we'll link
So
to it in the show notes. Yeah, for
cool.
sure.
And so it's I think it's just always great as a wine consumer, a wine professional, to be able to taste, well-aged wine. You learn so much about the grape, about the region, about how just wine ages, not to mention just a very pleasurable experience. So yeah, we're huge fans of what she does, and wine's just incredibly delicious.
Sounds great. I cannot believe how fast this time has gone.
I know.
We've been talking a while, but it's just boom. So I'm going to summarize a little bit here, Jane, because I haven't gotten to the other 56 questions. But is there anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Yeah, what I always like, kind of the platform, the soapbox I'm on these days is really just talking about how great Australian wine is, and I think that was such a revelation for us when we moved there, and it's something that we just want more people to experience, because I think, especially in the US, but in a lot of countries, the conversation around Australian wine, or what people know about Australian wine, is like cheap critter wine and
Mm-hmm.
big bold Shiraz.
Yes.
And there's just so much more that Australia offers. So yeah, it's definitely, I think, good for everyone to take another look at Australian wine.
Absolutely. And it's not one monolith when it comes to a climate. It's not just all warm climate. As you said, there's lots of regions that are very cool. I was impressed with that Tasmania Champagne comparison. Tasmania's an island close to the mainland. But
Yeah,
I've had Tasmanian Pinot Noir that just was amazing. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
stand shoulder to shoulder with Burgundy, but of course, it's got its
100%.
own signature.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
It's fantastic. All right. So, and how can people find you online?
So I'm at Janie Maxine on Instagram, Janey Maxine. Um, our work Instagram, which tends to be a little bit more active than my personal one,
Hmm.
is at Oz Wine Legends. So that's AUS Wine Legends.
Okay.
We have a website, legendaustralia.com. I have a personal website, janelopes.com. Um, yeah, that those all will get to me.
Excellent. And we will link to all of those in the show notes too, so that people can find you if they didn't catch that. I'm going to say goodbye in a minute, Jane, but don't hang up or log off. But it's been a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you for sharing all of this. I loved all the stories and finding out about your experiences. And I'm going to wish you well too with your new book. I'm sure it'll be a
Thank you.
hit. So thank you for spending this time with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye for now.